Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by wealthmanagement.com senior editor David Lenok.
This podcast is sponsored by Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Silicon Valley Community Foundation specializes in supporting advisors. We provide tailored solutions and personalized support to deliver on your clients' philanthropic visions and deepen impact. To learn more, visit svcf.org or email us at donate@svcf.org. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of wealthmanagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that could just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement planning, and much more written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our guest today is Doug Woodham. Doug is a managing partner of Art Fiduciary Advisors and the former president of the Americas for Christie's, the international auction house. Earlier in his career, he was a partner at McKinsey & Company, advising asset management and wealth management firms across the U.S., Europe, and Asia. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, go Blue, and is the author of Art Collecting Today, Market Insights for Everyone Passionate About Art, and his most recent release, Jean-Michel Basquiat, The Making of an Icon. Thanks so much for joining us, Doug.
Hey, well, thank you, David, for having me on your show.
So our subject, unsurprisingly, this episode will be none other than the inspiration for Doug's most recent book, Jean-Michel Basquiat. Basquiat was an American artist who rose to prominence during the 1980s as part of the Neo-Expressionism movement. He first achieved notoriety in the late 70s as part of a graffiti duo, of all things, and by the early 80s, his paintings were being exhibited in galleries and museums internationally. Between 83 and 85, he began a prolific collaboration with the much older and more established Andy Warhol. The duo produced over 150 works together, and although critical reviews were mixed at the time, the pieces are, unsurprisingly, now highly valuable. Basquiat sadly died at the age of 27 in 1988 of a heroin overdose. Since then, his work has steadily increased in value. In 2017, Untitled, a 1982 painting depicting a black skull with red and yellow rivulets, sold for a record-breaking $110.5 million, becoming one of the most expensive paintings ever purchased. Basquiat, unsurprisingly for someone so young who passed unexpectedly, died intestate. He left behind a trove of valuable works, over 1,000 of his own and more than 20 by Warhol. The resulting IRS disputes offer an interesting view into how his estate and those of his parents were valued, defended, and ultimately created dynastic wealth for his two sisters. Doug, the most retrospectives on Basquiat sort of ended his death. That's where we're going to start. Can you explain the unique problems posed by intestacy to Basquiat's estate and those of other creatives who die holding large amounts of potentially valuable but largely illiquid assets?
Happy to do that. Yeah, so when Basquiat died, look, he had been declining for a couple of years. His heroin addictions had really taken root and had taken over his life. His productivity had declined, though he would sometimes have periods where he would still make some magnificent works. So when he died without a will. He was 27. Most 27-year-olds don't have wills, and there was no written record of what he intended to happen. But it was a sad ending, not only because he died, of course, but there was a sort of flock of people that invaded his studio shortly after he died and scavenged to pull drawings out, probably stole a lot of money because he was a guy who liked cash. Um, and so his father, with whom he had a fractious yet loving relationship, became the executor of his estate. And it was a gnarly, complicated, difficult estate to wrap your arms around for a couple of reasons. One is during his lifetime, certainly the last 2 years of his life, he made around $250,000 a year from his selling his art, which in today's terms is $600,000. He spent everything. He saved nothing. There were no real estate assets, no cars, no expensive furniture, no jewelry. He spent everything. He was very generous, gave lots to friends. He had a suite at a local hotel that he escaped to. Drugs consumed a lot of his income. But what he did have was art. And when he died, between his studio, which was down in the East Village, and 2 storage bins where he had been stashing things, he had 171 paintings, or I should say his estate had 171 paintings, and about 1,000 of his drawings. And to give a sort of scale of what that represented, Basquiat made about 1,000 paintings in his life. So his estate had 20% of his productivity in paintings, and he made about 2,000 drawings that had 50% of his drawings. So it was an amazing treasure trove of works that, of course, needed to be appraised. Christie's was hired to do that appraisal, and they looked at every scrap of paper, every notebook, and determined that the art at that point in time was worth, date of death, $3.2 million. The father who oversaw all this, in addition to having to clean up the after effects of the studio that looked as if a storm had taken, root in it, and found all of this art and had it cataloged, he also found out that Basquiat had never filed an income tax return in his life. So that's $600,000 in today's terms. It was all spent on consumption. There wasn't any withholding taxes. So his father and the team that advised him had to recreate his P&L, if you will, because they were going to have to demonstrate to the IRS knowledge of what came in and what taxes, federal, state, and local, were due, and the penalties. That ended up being a $500,000, roughly speaking, tax bill before estate taxes. And it was a complicated, involved task to figure all of that out. So,
and needless to say, his parents themselves, who were sort of, this falls on, not exactly wealthy, didn't have $500,000 on hand to float this one.
No, they did not. I mean, his father was a trained accountant. His father was an upwardly mobile. His father had his own sources of income. His dad did not need Jean-Michel's wealth to lead a nice life. Mm-hmm. His parents were deeply estranged from each other. They actually separated in 1967 when Basquiat was 7 years old. They, stayed in touch, and they remained involved in Jean-Michel's life really up until he died. But between no income tax payments that needed to be cleaned up, figure out all these art-related works. So 9 months after Jean-Michel died, his father faced a huge liquidity crisis, mm-hmm. because it was sort of the equivalent of being art rich, but liquid asset poor. When Jean-Michel died, he only had $32,000 sitting in a checking account and nothing else but art. And so the dad, knew that he was going to have this huge delinquent income tax payment due. There were estate taxes that were going to be due. And so he actually took a leave of absence from his job to oversee this estate and bring order to it and figure out what assets to sell and what assets to keep. His dad was a clever guy. and decided early on that he wanted to keep as much of his son's work as possible. So the way he started to deal with his liquidity crisis was sell works that Jean-Michel owned by other artists. And there were 20 paintings by Warhol that he had traded or Warhol had gifted to him. And then there were some other paintings that the two of them did together. And so his father proceeded to sell many of those at an auction at Christie's that provided some of the needed short-term resources. But, another factor that happened, and, it occurs with lots of celebrity estates, and David, I'm sure you've talked about this before, all manner of people flock to the money or the appearance of money and start making claims. Oh, I own this. Oh, he told me I was going to get that. Oh, I have a side agreement. And so the estate was deluged with lawsuits, one in particular by Basquiat's girlfriend at the time he died, who was actually out partying with him the night before he died of an overdose. She was the one who found him lifeless the next morning. She actually filed a lawsuit trying to block Jean-Michel's father from selling any assets, art assets, claiming that she was entitled to a 50% ownership in everything. And that lawsuit proceeded. It consumed time, it consumed resources, it consumed legal bills. So it's a reminder how with celebrities, and particularly this artist, a liquidity crisis on top of many people with their hands out wanting things where there's no will and you've got illiquid assets that you're going to have to sort through. Very complicated, very gnarly. And it took over 3 years his dad did file an estate tax return. 3 years after he had filed it, he got the nasty gram from the IRS saying we're contesting this. And the essence of the I
imagine within that 3 years, and this is, I think, something to talk about here also, because you mentioned that initial valuation of 20% of his paintings and 50% of his drawings at $3 million.
Yes.
And anyone who's paying attention during the intro, we have one painting that sold for over $110 million.
Yes.
So in the ensuing time, the value of these items has increased just a little bit.
Yes.
Even though the art market was down in the early 90s, which is my understanding,
Yes.
He's still, this is why his father maybe was very intelligent to hold on to as much of his work as possible and sort of sell for the more established markets, more established artists. Because I think people know that when an artist, particularly a famous artist, dies, that their work is likely going to increase in value. I don't think they could have foreseen that it would increase quite this much.
Yes, nobody imagined this.
Yeah, but that is sort of the challenge faced, where you're having to take a snapshot for these valuations, although everyone knows the high likelihood is that these items are only going to go up.
Yes. Just to put some numbers around that, in the year before Basquiat died in 1988, the most one of his best paintings sold for was $30,000. He was reasonably well known at time of death, but there were other artists whose work was selling for much, much more. But so $30,000 in the 18 months after he died, there was a lot of speculative capital that moved into his market that actually caused his post-death prices to jump about 10x. So that $30,000 painting 12, 18 months after he died was trading for, let's say, $300,000. So the estate, the Basquiat art assets that his estranged parents inherited, the date of death appraisal said that those assets were worth $3.2 million, and they actually claimed a 70%, discount on it because they just own so much. But
can we talk about that for 1 second? Because that was one of the more interesting things I saw in the book, this idea of a blockage discount. Because as you mentioned, you said unique to artists is that it's his market.
Yes.
Right? When like a normal person dies, maybe they're illiquid, but they have office furniture or something.
Exactly.
You don't have to, if you sell all their office furniture at once, you don't have to worry about crashing the office furniture market.
Yes.
It's like, however, that's the other problem, is that these valuations are all over the place. And also, you can't sell it all at once because you'll
Yeah.
destroy the market forever.
Exactly.
So you went to this blockage discount, I guess, is what people would price in for tax purposes to play for the idea that we can't sell this all at once, and there has to be some
Yes.
time put in between
Yes.
some. They're not technically worth as much because we can't sell them all right now.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's an arcane part of appraisal land, but yeah, a blockage discount is it just really answers the following question. You own a lot of an artist's work. If you do date of death appraisal, you're supposed to initially look at each object in isolation and think about, gee, if you sold that in market conditions, around the time of death, what would that object have gone for? Okay, that gives you a certain number, $3.2 million in Basquiat's case. But oh my God, if you're forced to liquidate the vast majority of this stash of art all at once, it's going to plummet in value. And so the IRS does permit you to file paperwork to get what's called a blockage discount. It's how much you can reduce the value of the art to reflect the fact if you dumped it all or the vast majority, it's going to diminish in value. There was a side letter that Jean-Michel's dad included in the estate tax return claiming a 70% blockage discount factor. So that $3.2 million number for estate tax purposes was whacked 70%. That saved $1 million in federal estate taxes, let alone New York State estate taxes. So Gerard's, who was the dad, was an accountant, savvy, smart guy. I think he probably thought, why not? Let's go for it. I mean, the sort of incongruity about all this is, you're claiming a 70% discount because you were going to be forced to dump all this stuff on the market, but the prices of his work had jumped 10x in that time period. But the rules are, look, what would this stuff have been worth at the time of death? And then if in those circumstances at time of death, you had to dump all this stuff, that's how you come up with a blockage discount. So,
and I imagine the IRS, when it was worth $3 million, was probably like, 70, who cares?
Yeah.
But once it's worth $300 million, all of a sudden, 70, what are you that's ridiculous.
Exactly. So look, the IRS did contest. There was some litigation again about the Jean-Michel estate because the IRS originally came back and said no blockage discount whatsoever. You want 70%? It's zero, baby. They negotiated. I'd have to go back to look at my notes. I think they agreed on a 40% discount factor. And so rather than having to pay another $1 million in federal estate taxes, Gerard only had to pay like $80,000. So smart guy, it's like you might as well ask and see what you can get. But it's fascinating. And if you look in the settlement agreement, the estate tax settlement agreement, getting appraisals, fending off lawsuits, dealing with IRS claims, Gerard spent almost $750,000 on legal fees to manage his way through the estate over the 2-3 year period after his son died. If you put those into current dollars, it's a much bigger number. So it's just a reminder of how, when these complicated estates, and particularly with Jean-Michel, where there was no will, but thank God New York State rules determine where those assets pass. These are expensive things to settle, and you need a lot of liquidity to manage through it. If you got a bunch of illiquid assets, God bless. And it's a common problem with a lot of artists who die because many artists, like it or not, are spendthrifts and they've got a bunch of illiquid assets. Though I think many of them become a little more financially savvy. They've got real estate holdings and investment accounts that help those who come after them manage their estates.
Well, I mean, if your value of your items is tied up in your fame, then you could argue that being a spendthrift is just reinvesting in your brand, right? It's you write it all off.
Great point, Dave. I like where your brain's going.
But I think Gerard is the sort of kind of the star of the show here, which is ironic because we're talking about sort of one of the biggest stars in the history of the art world. But really for more normal, quote unquote, folks who aren't legendary artists, that's kind of one of the big lessons here is the importance of picking the right executor. A lot of times when people have wills, they choose someone who they trust, but it'll be like a family member. It'll be like Uncle Bob. And Uncle Bob maybe is a nice guy, but maybe doesn't quite realize what the extent of the responsibility he's agreed to take on is, and maybe doesn't have the expertise to deal with it. It's even worse in the case of intestacy, where a lot of times the administrator is just going to be assigned, or it's going to be whoever happens to care. So your chances of having a competent person is even less. Now, in this case, it's amazing. He was amazingly lucky.
Yes.
That it was not only someone who cared deeply, but someone who had was an accountant who had the know-how to actually follow through and innovate and try things in a way it would have been the perfect person to choose if you could have chosen. And that's not the way it works out the vast majority of the time.
Absolutely. No, I think well spoken, well said, David. Yeah, Gerard was a tough-minded, smart guy. I mean, Haitian immigrant who moved to the United States when he was 20 years old, upwardly mobile, made a life for himself. He's a really interesting character. And so without him, God only knows what would have happened to this estate. But what's fascinating is, we're talking about Jean-Michel. So his two parents inherited everything that Jean-Michel owned. So all of that art I talked about passed to the two of them who were estranged. His mom died in 2005. Mom was an interesting person. She was, for many years young in her life, she was a supervisor at New York Bell. She did succumb to some very significant mental health issues. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She was in and out of institutions, medicated, but recovered, active, spent time with Jean-Michel. This is not somebody who was a vegetable. There are actually scenes of Jean-Michel taking his mom to Warhol's studio when they were painting collaboration paintings. But
yeah, I mean, not particularly unusual now that we sort of have a better understanding of those things. Not a particularly unusual fact pattern in the modern day. It's on, in any given estate that someone who's inheriting is likely to have some degree of mental illness. It's just it's just by the numbers. Maybe not that much money into that degree of significance, but it's not such a crazy thing that only would happen in this weird story. That happens to everyone.
Well, one thing that I uncovered that I was surprised by is, so Matilda dies in 2005, and a couple of surprises emerge after her death. One is that she and her husband never got a divorce. Everybody thought they were divorced. They had never gotten a divorce. And second, the mom, whose name was Matilda, didn't have a will, or they couldn't find a will, which was bizarre because at the time she died, the value of the art assets that Matilda and her estranged husband owned was worth about $150,000. So go back to that $3.2 million when Jean-Michel died, go to 2005, it's now like $150,000. So she had an estate that was worth $75 million. No will. And so because she was still married to Gerard, guess what? He got
worked
50,
out, right? Yeah.
He got 50%, and he was appointed the executor.
Yeah, it's probably for the best that they know, honestly.
Because otherwise, I mean, I think New York state laws, at minimum, he was going to get 30%. Well, he got 50.
Yeah, and the government was probably going to take a big bite out of the rest. Yeah, by licking their chops.
Yeah. So when the mom died, and there's a certain there's sadness and a poignancy associated with it because, look, when Matilda probably never spent more than $25,000 a year living her life. Lived in Brooklyn. She was very close to her family. A brother would come visit her, but she really didn't spend any money on herself. She really didn't travel. Her estate was worth $75 to $80 million, half of which went to her husband tax-free, the other half to her daughters. They ended up paying $8 million in estate taxes on her estate. And so there's just something weird about somebody being worth so much, writing, the estate having to send a check for $8 million when they were only living on $25,000 a year at best.
More money than she probably spent herself in her entire life combined.
Exactly. And there was a fractious family relationship. The mom is actually buried not far from where Jean-Michel is buried in a magnificent Brooklyn cemetery called Greenwood, but she's actually buried in an unmarked grave. There's no headstone, which is sort of sad, but that was her case. So look, when the mom died, all of her estate either passed to Gerard or to her two surviving daughters. And Gerard died in 2013. And his estate was an order of magnitude even larger because there was a big run up in prices that occurred. Because he was an accountant, of course he had a will. And,
it would be such a disappointment if at the end of the story it was like, and then Gerard died in testing. It's like, oh, come on.
So I talk about this in the book. There are all these really, for the estate planning crowd, like, oh my God, you'll love these stories in the book because I bring all these tax and blockage discount issues alive, because this is a narrative nonfiction book, for a general reader. But Gerard died 2 months after there was a massive run up in a Basquiat painting that sold at Christie's. It was actually bought by a Malaysian fraudster by the name of Jolo, who had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund. At the time he bought this painting in 2013, people were sort of suspicious about him, but didn't know that he was sort of the fraudster to the degree he was. And Goldman Sachs was involved in it. I mean, there's a real cast of characters. Before he bought this painting, like the record price on a Basquiat was $25 million. He spent close to $50 million because he just wanted this painting. Massive run up in Basquiat prices. That caused a huge valuation problem for Gerard's estate because he died 2 months after this run up in prices, where prices literally doubled. And so how do you value the art that he still owned? Because again, he actually he hadn't sold much of the art that he had inherited when his son died. And so when his estate filed an estate tax return, they sort of, as best I could tell, ignored that run up in prices, saying, that was an anomaly, we're not going to discount that or take that into account. The IRS did end up contesting that. And so they had a $100 million bid-ask spread between what the estate thought those assets were worth versus what the IRS thought they were worth. To this day, the IRS and Gerard's estate have agreed on the value of the assets, but they still have not fully settled his estate, because when he did file his estate tax return, his estate paid like $50 million in estate taxes, and the IRS wanted like a whole lot more, and they're still negotiating, still hasn't been settled. But the long and
it's
short,
wild. It's a wonder that any of these estates ever get settled, because it's like, if you're in a case where like one maniac with money to burn, or I think in this case likely money to launder, can just set the whole thing on fire like that. Like, how is it ever a settled issue when the IRS can always just turn around and come back and be like, actually, it's a miracle that any of this happens. And even, to take it down to a smaller scale, it's like someone who, wrote a textbook, and then that was their small textbook they wrote, but then it got picked up by the Texas school systems right before they died. It's like, well, how do you value that now?
Great point.
These things can happen on a smaller scale with creatives that can really throw a wrench into things. I mean, having too much money, I guess, is a good problem to have, but not having the money to be able to pay the tax, as we've shown, could be an issue.
Yeah. Well, maybe just to, final point on sort of estate taxes and wealth. So again, we sort of walked through Jean-Michel's death, his mom's death, and then his dad's death. And, the connective tissue here was both his dad, an accountant, being a savvy businessman, being able to manage this, all of the art assets that he and his wife inherited, many of which they kept, that they only sold when they had to. There were other forces and factors that I talk about in the book about why Basquiat prices soared that have to do with some savvy collectors, investors, identity politics coming into the art world, etc. But if you look today, Jean-Michel had two sisters, both of whom now oversee the estate. They're the joint executors of the estate. They are now among the wealthiest women in the United States, using very sort of conservative valuations and using the treasure trove of documents that I was able to get from the tax court in Washington. They're between the art they own and Basquiat-related licensing businesses, they're worth like $750 million. And they've got an active licensing business that they run where Basquiat artworks are on sneakers, on T-shirts, on water bottles, on candles that are sold all over the world. I mean, if you walk around streets in Singapore, you'll see kids with Basquiat T-shirts on. In Paris, they got sneakers. In New York, people have got tattoos. And so, there's substantial licensing revenue that they earn, the value of the art assets that they own. They're worth, I think, conservatively, and there are footnotes in the book that go into the calculations for people who really want to dig in on all this stuff. $750 million. So there's an exceptionalism associated with Basquiat's story about how, he went from $30,000 paintings in his lifetime to $100 million paintings posthumously. And my book is really trying to explain the full narrative behind why that happened. But the tax issues and the estate planning issues are really an important part of the second half of the book, which is really about what happens after Basquiat died, because the numbers here are so large. The sort of twists and turns associated with the valuation and wealth are just utterly fascinating. As some people have told me, look, people love, sex and money. Sometimes money's more interesting to them than sex.
Yeah, their own little death and taxes, right? It's everyone's favorite inevitabilities. So we are coming up on the end of our time. I'd love to thank Doug Woodham for coming on and just sharing this story with us. And there's a lot more to it than what we talked about. We only have 30 minutes here. So there's an entire book. The book itself, Jean-Michel Basquiat, The Making of an Icon, is available. Look it up, buy it. It's pretty good. Thanks so much for joining us, Doug.
Hey, thank you, David.
And for all the listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. This podcast is sponsored by Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Silicon Valley Community Foundation specializes in supporting advisors. We provide tailored solutions and personalized support to deliver on your clients' philanthropic visions and deepen impact. To learn more, visit svcf.org or email us at donate@svcf.org.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of InformaWealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.